Now I'll run through a quick agenda and then we can get started. So first, Amalia is going to go and talk about the importance of a climate strategy. Next, Ferdy will go over setting the foundation with carbon accounting, as well as reducing emissions aligned with science. From there, Isabella will discuss managing climate risk, and I will be talking about monitoring and updating your progress through CDP. And lastly, we will have some time for a Q&A at the end. So without further ado, I will hand this over to Amalia.
Thank you, John, for that great introduction. So I'm going to talk about the importance of robust climate strategy. And that usually correlates to the why you need a robust climate strategy. So here you can see that climate change is transforming the business environment in which companies operate. And we see this as global weather becomes more extreme, the threat that climate change poses for companies, it's no longer just theoretical, it is happening. So not only is your business a part of the world's acceleration in climate change, but climate change is affecting your business operations. So businesses today have to work to protect their assets and supply chains from increasingly severe hurricanes, heat waves, fires, and droughts, as well as new and strict regulations to limit the worst financial effects of climate change. What this means is that first off, you need the strategy to prepare and mitigate climate change impacts on your company, but also to be part of the solution to limit the worst impacts on society by reducing your own environmental footprint. That is also now becoming more and more expected of stakeholders and society in general. Now, to have a robust climate strategy, it needs to be dynamic. And what do I mean by that? So frameworks and regulations are developing, and then so should your strategy. I want you to keep in mind that this is a new field with new science, so better methodology approach and regulation is only going to increase in the forthcoming years. It's therefore essential that you create a solid foundation and be dynamic and adaptable to these upcoming changes. But luckily, the elements that we're going to go through in this presentation, it will set you up for future success and show you how to adapt your strategy accordingly. So stakeholders are also increasingly expecting that your strategy is also part of solving the challenge. But what is this overarching challenge? So collectively, we have to stabilize the global temperature to a maximum of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. Now, to achieve this objective, global carbon emissions needs to be reduced by at least 50% each decade, reaching net zero by 2050. But 2050, that seems very far out. Let's talk a little bit more about the short term. So creating a robust climate strategy will also set you up for success when it comes to upcoming regulations. And I want you to mark my words. 2023 will be the year of climate regulation here in the US. And the most discussed regulation is the upcoming, and you probably have heard of this already, the SEC climate disclosure rules to enhance and standardize climate-related disclosures for investors. So the final version of this is set to be released in April already this year, and it will demand disclosure for publicly listed companies regarding their carbon footprint across the value chain, meaning emissions in scope 1, 2, and 3 needs to be reported on in the near future. So the proposed rules also includes disclosing efforts and targets set to reduce emissions and how you as a company are managing climate risks. So very similarly, we also had the Biden-Harris administration that proposed this fall the Federal Supplier Climate Risks and Resilience Rule to protect the federal government's own supply chains from significant climate-related financial risks. So this proposed rule would require major contractors to prepare a greenhouse gas inventory, to also assess climate-related risks, set targets aligned with the newest climate science, and also report publicly in alignment with the GHG protocol, TCFD, CDP, and SBTi. Okay, so I mentioned right now a lot of acronyms, and you probably have heard some of them before, but I want to ask you, what do they really mean? So these acronyms are international frameworks and best practice when it comes to creating and reporting on a robust climate strategy. In fact, I would even say that they are at the core of every robust climate strategy. And when creating a climate strategy, you want to make sure that you're aligning it with the best methodology so you're allocating your resources effectively and that it's aligned with stakeholders' reporting expectations. So building your strategy toward meeting the recommendations in these frameworks, that will set you up for success. And also, any new upcoming regulation, both here in the US and in Europe, is based upon these standards when it comes to climate disclosure. So throughout this webinar, we are going to take a deep dive into the frameworks and give you some key action steps on how to move forward when creating that robust climate strategy aligned with the best practice methodology. And I mentioned climate strategy a lot now. So what does that actually look like? And maybe even more importantly, what does it actually entail? So this roadmap sets out a streamlined and efficient pathway to accomplishing your climate-related goals. First, you want to develop a carbon inventory to measure your total scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. That provides a clear insight into what area your company is emitting the most greenhouse gas emissions. From then, you can now start to assess your carbon reduction potentials. So completing a full carbon accounting allows you to have a clear picture of potential areas of improvement and then start to take action. You should also further develop those identified initiatives into a low carbon transition plan and set reduction targets aligned with the newest climate science. Again, you want to show your stakeholders how your strategy is being part of solving the challenge. You also want to mature your strategy by addressing how you're managing those climate-related risks and opportunities in your value chain that will impact your business financially. And then you need a governance structure to ensure that you are harmonizing your climate strategy with the overall business strategy and operations. And I mentioned this before, but this is an ever-evolving field, so you need to review, monitor, and update the process accordingly and be flexible and adaptable to changes. So this webinar is tailored to deep down into the components to set any company up for success when developing and reporting on a climate strategy that will meet the demand from society and from regulations. And now I'm going to hand it over to Ferdia that is going to take you through the foundation when establishing a robust climate strategy.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Amalia, and good afternoon, everybody. So today I'm going to be going through setting the foundation with carbon accounting for your climate strategy. And then after that, I'll talk a little bit about setting targets and how you can do that for your business. So let's dive right in. One of the most important aspects when formulating any strategy is to have a really solid foundation of knowledge. And in climate strategy terms, that means carbon accounting. So the foundation of any good, robust climate strategy is going to be built on carbon accounting. Now, as I'm sure many of you here today are aware, that carbon accounting is a way of measuring how much greenhouse gas emissions an organization emits and quantifies its impact on the climate. Before I get into that, I'm just going to touch on these benefits of carbon accounting and what it can mean for your business. So the first one is it can help you stay compliant. Now, regulators are increasingly requiring businesses to disclose their carbon emissions, as Amalia mentioned about the SEC proposal, so it can really help you stay ahead of the game by carrying out your carbon inventory. Second is building brand equity. So carbon accounting displays business value for consumers, employees, investors, and other groups of stakeholders as well. It can really give you this competitive edge and prove to be a point of difference in a sustainable marketplace. Third, then, it can increase your efficiency by quantifying your business's emissions all along the value chain. You can pinpoint inefficiencies and kind of raise that bottom line to be more cost effective. And finally, then, it can help future-proof your business against climate risks. So these are both transitional and physical risks and can provide your business with a lot of resiliency moving forward. So what do we do to measure our carbon accounting? Well, we use a standardized framework called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And using this framework, it helps organizations to understand their carbon emissions so they can identify hotspots, and also it enables them to begin their reduction efforts with high impact actions. And it's really important to compile a comprehensive greenhouse gas inventory, as it improves a company's understanding of its emissions profile and any potential greenhouse gas liability or exposure it might have. So we do have a motto here at CEMAsys, which is what you can measure, you can manage, and measuring your emissions can really help you manage your strategy to identify the most effective carbon reduction opportunities. So you can see here on the slide that the greenhouse gas protocol is broken down into 3 scopes. So scope 1 first is direct emissions that are produced from owned or controlled entities. So these are things like combustion, whether they be stationary or mobile combustion, refrigerants, process emissions from any manufacturing, things of that nature. That's all in scope 1. Scope 2 then is indirect emissions from energy produced at an off-site location. And this typically involves electricity, heating, cooling and steam, and these kind of things as well. Now these are important scopes, but scope 3 then, this is indirect emissions from the rest of your value chain. Now this will encompass the majority of your emissions, and it's broken down into 15 different categories, separated into upstream and downstream emissions. And what's really important to remember here with scope 3 is when you are starting your carbon accounting, you might start with 1 or 2 different categories, but you really want to have a benchmarking and go through your entire value chain to understand what your emissions are in each of these categories. And this will help build this much more accurate carbon map as you move forward with your strategy. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about how to effectively manage your data once you are recording it. And the first is using the greenhouse gas protocol to identify and quantify your emissions data. This is a widely internationally recognized framework and can be very, very beneficial to developing a strategy like this. So when recording your carbon accounting data, you really want to have the most complete picture possible. So managing your data itself effectively is really key. So your emissions data, it can be quantified by combining your activity data with an emission factor. Now your activity data, this is a quantitative measure of a level of activity that you might be conducting in your operation that results in greenhouse gas emissions. So for example, we're talking about gallons of fuel consumed here, pounds of a material purchased, things in this nature. And this is combined then with an emission factor, which is a factor that converts this activity data into greenhouse gas emissions data to give you an output, for example, of kilograms of CO2 emitted per litre of fuel consumed. So when you are looking at these emission factors, you want to have the most company-specific emission factors as possible. So whatever your operation is, using emission factors for that operation, because again, this will give you the most accurate emissions map for your company all along your value chain. So when you do start looking at implementing measures to mitigate emissions, you'll know where the hotspots are. And finally then, what you really want is a system tailored towards your specific needs. Now, some of you might have started your carbon accounting already. You might be doing it through Excel. We don't recommend this as you look to develop your strategy over time. You really want a user-friendly system that can give you kind of simplified inputs and then give you good quality outputs, whether that be charts or graphs for whatever business meetings or client meetings that you might have. So that's kind of a really key element, knowing a system, being able to use it, and then being able to look at year-on-year development of your strategy over time. So how do you actually start your carbon accounting? Well, the first thing is you want to choose your specialized management system. So being able to have all your data in one place to be able to measure it and manage it and then see how it develops is step 1. Now, when it comes to the actual carbon accounting and gathering data, the first thing you want to do is map and measure your emissions in scope 1 and scope 2. So again, those emissions from company owned and controlled sources, direct emissions for scope 1, and indirect emissions produced at an offsite location. So things like electricity for your scope 2. So that's a great place to start. Then what you want to do is have a scope 3 screening of all these 15 categories to define what is material to you. Again, not every company might be reporting on all 15 categories, but having this screening helps you identify where your emissions are along the value chain, and again, helps you produce that accurate map so you can identify these hotspots. You can start by talking about like 1 or 2 categories, but really, as you can see in step 4, you want to develop your scope 3 reporting process to include all the relevant categories, which is with as much good quality activity data as you possibly can. And then this will help you identify emissions hotspots, and then you can begin to set targets to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. So as you can see, this carbon accounting really is the foundation. And I'm going to move on now and talk to you a little bit about the next step of reducing emissions aligned with science. So again, I'm just going to start off here by looking at some of the benefits you can get to your company by setting these targets. So the first is increased profitability. So setting targets really helps companies remain lean and efficient and building resistance and resilience against any future risks. Second, then it can improve efficiency again along your value chain, helping to reduce any inefficiencies that you might have. It can also lead to greater innovation, with the transition to a low carbon economy already underway and growing in momentum. Companies that are aligning their strategies with this step change are opening themselves up to a whole new world of opportunities within this sustainability market. And then finally, you get greater access to capital. As I'm sure many of you are aware, investors are increasingly taking interest in businesses' climate strategies and if they're setting targets. And this really helps boost investor confidence within your company when they see you're setting targets, you're doing a carbon accounting, you have a resilient strategy moving forward. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit now about the science and how to actually achieve net zero, because we hear a lot about that today. So as public awareness of the need to reach net zero emissions at the global level has grown, the number of companies committing to reach this net zero emissions target has also increased rapidly in recent years. So this kind of public awareness of net zero has led to a lot of companies sort of diluting the definition of it. So I think it's imperative that we understand here today a common definition of what net zero actually is and how companies can get there. So net zero is the balance between the amount of greenhouse gas emissions emitted to and the amount of greenhouse gas emissions removed from the atmosphere. So science-based targets, these provide a clearly defined pathway for companies to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and to reach this target. And it helps prevent the worst impacts of climate change and really, again, helps future-proof your business growth. So we all believe firmly that the private sector must play a fundamental role in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So embedding these science-based targets in a sustainability strategy is very crucial. And these targets, they're only considered science-based if they align with what the latest climate science deems necessary to meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. And this is limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, the IPCC, they've confirmed that in order to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, the world needs to halve its CO2 emissions by 2030 and then reach this goal of net zero by mid-century or around 2050. So what kind of framework can you use to reach these goals? Well, there's this organization called the Science-Based Target Initiative. And this is a global body that enables businesses to set ambitious reduction targets in line with the latest climate science. And the SBTi, it plays a really critical role by conducting in-depth research and analysis, as well as consulting with different stakeholders in this area. So scientists, sustainability professionals, and people like that. And they do this in order to develop science-based target setting methods that are, one, transparent, but also robust and actionable, which is what you really want when you're setting your targets to see proper change. Now, the initiative defines and promotes best practice in science-based target setting for various different sectors. So it doesn't matter what sector you're involved in, there is guidance to help you set these targets, no matter what sector you work in. And the SBTi offers you resources and guidance to reduce any challenges that you might have, especially if you're new to this, with adoption of these targets. And they also independently assess and approve your company's targets. So I'm going to move on now and talk to you a little bit about how you guys can actually set targets and how you can achieve net zero with the SBTi. So there's usually two strategies. One is setting near-term targets and then also setting long-term targets. And this is where it comes back to having a really good carbon accounting. This is your foundation, because then you can see your emissions hotspots and you want to identify these and focus your near-term targets on where your hotspots are, usually within the 5 to 10 year time frame, to implement strategies to reduce these methods. So calculating these near-term targets as a milestone, if you build these small steps up, these can help you reach your long-term targets. Now, the long-term target should be reaching net zero by 2050. So this is a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by about 90 to 95%. Now, for large corporations, it can be very difficult to completely mitigate all your emissions by 100%. So that's why we have 90 to 95%. The remaining 5 to 10% is what we call residual emissions. And these can be offset in different ways when you get to that point through carbon offsets and other such projects as well. Ideally, this is to be achieved by 2050 or even sooner than that, as some companies are setting more ambitious targets. And this can really help drive economy-wide alignment and long-term business planning as well. So just to kind of tie all this together again, where do you want to start? So the first thing when you leave here today is just starting. You really want to get that first step started, which is with your carbon accounting. So your scope 1 and scope 2, and then having that benchmarking of scope 3 and really trying to develop that carbon inventory as you move forward. And this can all be done through the greenhouse gas protocol. Next then, when you've developed this carbon inventory, you want to look at setting targets. You can do this with the Science-Based Target Initiative, as I've just talked about, setting the near-term targets that are focused and building up to those long-term targets of achieving net zero. Third, then, you can then begin to identify reduction measures through low carbon transition plans and other things like this through the Science-Based Target Initiative. And then finally, then, after doing all this work, you want to report publicly on your progress, because there's a lot of benefits to be had to other stakeholders. So by developing your carbon inventory and setting targets, it can be very beneficial to you going forward, as John is going to talk about a little bit later. And one of the main ways to do this is reporting through CDP. Now, that kind of wraps up what I was here to talk to you about today. So I'm going to pass you off to Isabella, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about managing climate risks within your strategy.
Thank you for that great introduction about carbon accounting and the SBTi. Everything that Ferdia just discussed is the business impacts on climate change. So I'm going to shift our focus just a little bit to talk about the climate change impacts on businesses through discussing managing your climate risks. So why are climate risks so important to discuss? It's truly due to the fact that they are a financial threat. In 2021 alone, there was $343 billion in weather and climate-related economic losses. And that can be due to the fact that climate events are a threat multiplier. You can see on your screen now a figure of climate events affecting so many different parts of society. Let's go through it in more detail so we can have a deep understanding of climate events being a threat multiplier. So if we take a climate event such as warming or a wildfire, that of course is going to affect people's livelihoods, causing issues such as unemployment and access to food and resources. Because of these changes in people's livelihoods, it's going to directly affect the economy in the way that finances and businesses are run, causing industry transformation as well as a relocation of capital. We have already started to see these shifts as we are shifting to a more sustainable economy today. These changes in finances and businesses are going to shift the global trade, shifting trade routes, as well as causing higher carbon and tax prices. And this can all really accumulate into social instability, causing humanitarian crises, as well as conflict over food and natural resources. So now we can understand how climate events are a threat multiplier and it can affect so many different parts of society. And that is why the World Economic Forum has predicted 5 out of the 10 most severe risks in the next decade to be environmental. We need to start thinking about these issues and ideas today so that your company can better handle them. So let's look at climate risk on a more granular approach and then within your company. As I just described, climate change is going to affect your company and be a financial threat if climate risks are not identified, mitigated, implemented into your overall risk management strategy. So how are you going to be able to implement them into your overall risk management strategy? You're going to want to look into your organization as a whole, across multiple dimensions, including strategic, financial, operational, as well as your reputation, along your entire value chain, including your raw materials, your transportation, and your customer base. And lastly, across any region your company is operating in, because as you guys know, climate change is going to affect different regions in different ways. But by claiming a holistic approach when identifying material climate risk, your company can be set up for success. But what is best practice when identifying those risks and opportunities? It is currently outlined by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or better known as the TCFD, which provides a useful categorization of climate risks and opportunities. The framework was developed to help public companies and other organizations more effectively disclose their climate-related risks and opportunities through their existing reporting process. So once again, putting your climate-related risks and opportunities into your overall risk management strategy. This global framework is already shaping other things, such as the SEC proposal that Amalia mentioned earlier, which is modeled off of this TCFD framework. So let's go through it in more detail. If we look at the figure on the left, you're going to see the 4 core elements of the recommended climate-related financial disclosures. It starts with governance, which is the organization's governance around climate-related risk and opportunities. That's followed by strategy, which is the actual and potential impacts of climate-related risks and opportunities on an organization's business, strategy, as well as financial planning. Next, risk management, which is the process used by the organization to identify, assess, and manage climate-related risks. And this all accumulates to targets and metrics, which are used to assess and manage relevant climate-related risks and opportunities. So within these 4 core elements that I just discussed, there are additional 11 disclosures that are built into these 4 core elements. I'm not going to go through those in more detail today. Instead of I'm going to focus on that strategy part that I just discussed. And we can now have our focus on the figure on the right, which is a breakdown of that strategy. As you can see, it's broken down into both risks and opportunities, where risks are further broken down into transitional risks, which include policy and legal, technology, market, as well as reputation, whereas physical risk can be categorized as both acute and chronic. Opportunities, on the other hand, can be anything that your company deems as an opportunity as we begin to shift to a more sustainable economy. It can include energy sources, products, market, as well as resilience. Both these risks and opportunities is going to directly affect your strategic planning as well as your overall risk management strategy. Once again, we're seeing that theme of risks, climate-related risks in your overall risk management strategy. This, of course, is all then going to have a financial impact on your company. So how has the TCFD actually developed over time and gotten to the point of it modeling the SEC disclosures? If we look at the figure on the left, you can see that the TCFD has had a 600% increase over the past 4 years of the company's reporting with this framework, both in the financial sector as well in various other sectors. In 2022, there was $217 trillion worth of assets reporting through this framework, with over 1,500 financial institutions and 80% of the companies in line with at least one of the 11 recommended disclosures. But there's only 4% in line with all 11 recommended disclosures. So the TCFD did a status report with 680 of the companies to understand some of the challenges that they're still facing with the framework. And as you can see, the first challenge is developing a process for identifying, assessing, and managing climate-related risks. The solution we have found here at CEMAsys is integrating climate risk into your overall risk management strategy, and using that same process you have in place for other risks is the best way to handle your climate-related risks. The second challenge you can see is conducting a climate-related scenario analysis, selecting relevant scenarios, and identifying key inputs and parameters. I'm sure most of you guys know this, but a climate scenario analysis is a process an organization can undertake to imagine and plan for a plausible future scenario involving the large-scale and complex nature of climate change. So just as you would use any other scenario analysis within your company, you're going to use that same logic for climate-related scenario analysis. And it's going to improve your overall decision-making, with more information about future climate possible outcomes in the regions you're operating in. So let's take a step back and look at the two different perspectives that are both important to consider when discussing climate change. Ferdia gave us a great introduction of the first perspective of the impacts your business have on climate change. This includes understanding your carbon footprint and taking steps to reduce it through carbon accounting and participating in initiatives such as the SBTi. By setting these targets and reducing your emissions and publicly reporting on your progress, you can demonstrate your commitment to sustainability and better manage your environmental impact. The second perspective that I touched on is the climate change impacts on your business. This includes understanding your potential risks and opportunities associated with climate change and how they can impact your operations, supply chain, and your overall financial performance. The TCFD framework provides a useful way to categorize and understand both your risks and opportunities. It's important for businesses to use both perspectives when building your sustainability strategy. By understanding your impact on climate change, as well as the impact that climate change has on your business, you can make more informed decisions and better prepare for the future. I'm now going to pass it off to John to talk more about monitoring and updating your progress.
All right, thank you, Isabella, for that. So now that we've gone over those first initial steps, I will get into ways you can monitor and update your progress. So just to recap, at this point in our roadmap, we've gone through steps 1 through 5. Ferdia explained how to develop your carbon inventory, assess ways to reduce carbon impact, and transitioning to net zero through setting science-based targets. From there, Isabella covered managing climate risks and opportunities, as well as combining climate and business strategies. So now we're at the last step, which is to monitor and update progress. So there are a lot of ways to monitor and update your progress when we're at this stage in developing a climate strategy. The first is governance. So it's important to have a strong governance structure in place within your company to ensure that you're implementing the appropriate measures for your climate plan. Without this, your climate strategy won't be enforced and it won't be able to progress. Another way is reassessing your risks. So as earlier mentioned, climate risks are a risk multiplier. So continuously going through your company's operations and analyzing risks is extremely important so that you can identify as well as mitigate climate risks that could potentially pose a massive financial threat. And one way of doing this is through TCFD. Next is yearly measuring of your emissions. So the only way to improve on your emissions reductions is to measure them every year. Following the greenhouse gas protocol, your emission data will be easily organized and viewable. This way you can see your year-on-year changes, where you progressed, and how well your reduction initiatives have worked. Another way is to track your targets. So once you've set your science-based near and long-term targets, you'll need to track them so that you stay in line with the science and your pathway towards net zero. It's important to benchmark where your company stands to reach the goals that you've committed to. And lastly is to disclose publicly. So there are a lot of ways to publicly disclose your climate information. A few examples are either through a sustainability report or through another framework known as CDP, which I will get into in a few slides. But disclosure is important because it drives strategy development, whether that's through a TCFD or CDP report. And it's really just about starting somewhere. So starting somewhere with the best practices and being transparent. And this creates awareness both internally and for stakeholders, which leads your strategic development. And it's important to note that this isn't a one-off exercise. So climate strategy is something that continuously has to be reassessed. So these are things that you'll have to do every year to continue progress. So now I'm going to dive into the benefits of public disclosure. And there are several, so I'll just go over a few here. So first is to protect and improve your company's reputation. A big part of disclosing is the idea of building trust through transparency and to respond to the rising environmental concerns among the public. A second benefit is to boost a competitive advantage. So through disclosing, your company gains a competitive edge in numerous areas like stock market performance, access to capital, and winning tenders. A third benefit of disclosing is tracking and benchmarking your progress. So you'll be able to benchmark your environmental performance against your own previous years, as well as against your own industry peers. And next, you'll be able to uncover environmental risks and opportunities that would otherwise be overlooked. And lastly, to get ahead of upcoming regulations. As we've covered, mandatory disclosure is gaining momentum, and by measuring and disclosing your climate impacts, you'll be in a much better position when these regulations do come into effect. And one reporting framework that helps guide and drive companies' climate ambition is CDP. So the CDP, or Carbon Disclosure Project, is a not-for-profit charity that runs the global disclosure system for investors, companies, cities, states, and regions to manage their environmental impacts. As the world is taking these steps towards building a climate-safe, deforestation-free, and water-secure future, ambitious corporate action is needed. And the world's economy looks to CDP as the gold standard of environmental reporting, and it has the most comprehensive data set on corporate and city action. Basically, it's the most widely used investor reporting framework for environmental data. Over 680 investors with over $130 trillion in assets requested companies disclose through CDP on climate change, water security, and forests. So this includes over 18,700 companies that reported through CDP. And over 1,100 cities, states, and regions disclosed environmental information through CDP. So based on your disclosure, your company will be scored from an F to an A. An F being that you've been requested to respond, but you haven't. Whereas an A score shows leadership and corporate responsibility towards climate change, and that your company has undergone extensive measures to help solve climate change issues. And the score provided by CDP is set up to guide companies' climate strategy towards sustainability leadership. So here we have an overview of what the CDP questionnaire looks like for 2023. As you can see, it's broken down into 16 chapters that cover a range of topics within your sustainability operations. And each chapter provides a sort of building block for your company to optimize your climate strategy while simultaneously viewing sustainability from a holistic approach. It's important to note that annual revisions and developments to the questionnaire reflect and drive best practice in a continuous effort to provide quality guidance. So you may have noticed we've already discussed some of the chapters throughout this webinar, and that's because CDP is structured in a way that provides a sort of checklist for your company to go through and expand upon each year. This shows how CDP really does bring together all of the frameworks mentioned earlier. So you can see here, governance, risks and opportunities, and business strategy directly relate to TCFD. Targets and performance relates to SBTi, and the emissions and energy chapters relate back to carbon accounting and the greenhouse gas protocol. So you can see here how CDP connects the dots with all the frameworks in creating this robust climate strategy. All right, so we've gone through the process of what a roadmap towards a robust climate strategy looks like. Here are some key takeaways and basically a list of what your company needs to start doing if you've not already done so. So this will ensure your company is aware of where they need to be regarding structuring their climate strategy. So first, set the foundation by developing a carbon inventory. So this means mapping and measuring your carbon footprint following the greenhouse gas protocol. So these are emissions across your own operations and entire value chain. So you can start with scope 1 and 2 and then build on scope 3. The next step is to assess your carbon reduction potentials. So this is looking at the areas where your company can reduce emissions. And from there, you can develop a low carbon transition plan, as well as set science-based targets for best practice and get them approved by the Science Based Targets Initiative. As we mentioned, this will align your strategy with the latest science and get you on a path towards net zero. From there, this is the time to identify and manage all of your climate-related risks and opportunities. So this is realizing both how your company affects climate change and how climate change affects your company. And a key element to this is creating a scenario analysis. And this way you can view realistic emission reduction pathways. So at this point, we can start to bring both climate and business strategy and operations together. So this is merging these strategies as one. And lastly, you will disclose your information so it's publicly available and work towards improving in the next year. So everything we've discussed today are all components of a robust climate strategy and are essential to have in place on your pathway towards sustainability success. All right, so that concludes the material we have for you all today. We reserve this time for questions, so we're going to go through the chat and answer as many questions as we can with the remaining time. All right, so let me take a look here. We've got a lot. I see one here on emissions data. All right, so I'm going to start measuring our company's emissions in scope 1 and 2. What kind of data am I looking for? Ferdia, you want to grab this one?
Yeah, sure. That's a good question, and one we get a lot, especially with people starting off, about what data to use and where to get it. We always recommend using activity data. There is spend-based data, which I touched on a little bit, but spend-based data can usually be more inaccurate when developing your carbon inventory. So using activity data is the best data that you can use. You want to identify first and foremost where that activity is coming from. So what amount of fuel are you using in your company cars? How do you heat your buildings, your warehouses, things like that? And usually we found through working with clients that most suppliers do keep detailed records of this kind of data. So it's about going and identifying and asking the right people. There's often these kind of energy management systems or ERPs as well. So talking to your finance or your procurement department to first understand, okay, if you have this data, and then talking to suppliers if not. But yeah, activity data is really the best for this foundation of carbon accounting.
Great question. All right, I see one here on TCFD. So let's see. What value does the TCFD process bring as opposed to just listing risks and opportunities that competitors in other similar sectors have? Want to grab this one, Isabella?
Yeah, that is a really great question. Off the top of my head, the first thing that comes to mind is the TCFD framework helps companies to identify and disclose both their risks and their opportunities. Additionally, it provides guidance in sector-specific case studies on how to best then manage those risks and opportunities. So it's bringing value just beyond those disclosures. The next thing that comes to mind is really knowing that it's focused on climate change being relatively new. So for management and board level executives who might not have a full understanding of what climate change is, it can really help bridge that gap because the TCFD suggests a company-wide process that helps organizations, key players, understand how climate change is going to affect the people, processes, and their overall bottom line, and input those climate risks and opportunities into their overall business strategy. The last thing that comes to mind is that it not only focuses on those risks, but also on the opportunities. And in order to be resilient in the face of climate change, you need to also understand the opportunities that you can have as we begin to transition to a lower carbon economy. And the TCFD suggests ways for organizations within different sectors to actually start that transition. So those are the key things that come to mind, just thinking about it off the top of my head. But yeah.
Awesome. I see a question here about if we can send the slides. Yes, we can. Just drop your email in the chat box and we can send the slides. I see another one here about science-based targets. This one's asking, what is the timeline for setting and achieving a science-based target? Do you want to get this one, Ferdia?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's another good question. So once companies take the first step in the SBTi process, which is committing to a target, after that you have about 2 years to formally set the target, submit for approval, and then communicate it externally. So once you start that, it's kind of then an internal process, depending on how long it takes to do your carbon accounting. That can be anywhere from 2 months to 12 months, depending on availability of data and how much scope 3 work and things like that you're doing. So setting that foundation, that's what you want to do. Also then how long it takes kind of internally, if you have to run it up the chain of command to different management practices or boards to actually set that target and all agree on what it is kind of the next step. After that, you want to submit it to the SBTi for validation. And once it gets into the SBTi, that can take between kind of 6 and 8 months for them to validate it. So about 2 years, including all those steps, is a good timeline to follow.
Awesome. All right. I see one here for CDP, so I'll take this one. Who is requesting environmental data via CDP, and how will using CDP improve stock market performance? Who is requesting? Well, investors as well as other people along your supply or value chain. And it improves your reputation by showing to the public your commitment to mitigating the effects of climate change. So with all the benefits of disclosure previously mentioned, these can all be key elements in improving your stock market performance over time. All right, well, that's about it for questions. So that's all the time we have. We'll go through the chat, and if there's any questions we missed, we can follow up with an email. Just make sure to list your email with your question. And lastly, I'd like to add that CEMAsys is offering a 1-hour free ESG guidance. So if you're interested, just send us an email at news@CEMAsys.com. But thank you all again for coming. We hope you gained some valuable insight in developing a robust climate strategy, and have a great rest of the day.